They came with flashing lights, fake uniforms, and the kind of arrogance that only comes when people think they can get away with anything. To the neighbors, it looked like just another day of the HOA flexing its so-called power. But behind those counterfeit badges and staged authority was something darker, a plan rooted in prejudice, intimidation, and the belief that no one would question them when the target was a black man living in a neighborhood they never believed he belonged in. Their boots stomped on his driveway, their radios crackled with rehearsed chatter, and their voices carried the tone of men who thought they owned the world. They weren't real police, but in their minds, it didn't matter. All they wanted was to humiliate him, to drag him out in front of everyone, and to prove that their rules were above the law. But what they didn't know, what no one watching, from behind closed blinds could ever imagine, was that the man they came to take down was no ordinary homeowner. He was someone who had survived the worst, fought the most dangerous enemies, and carried secrets that could silence entire armies. These fake cops weren't walking into an arrest. They were walking into a battlefield. He had chosen this neighborhood for its silence, not its noise. After years of service, years that demanded everything from his body and mind, he wanted nothing more than peace. The black man who now lived on the edge of the cul-de-sac wasn't the kind of neighbor who threw parties, blasted music, or cluttered his lawn with distractions. He was disciplined, private, and deliberate in every choice he made. To most, he appeared like a quiet man just trying to enjoy the life he had earned. But to the Homeowners Association, his presence was a challenge to their control, and his skin color was an excuse to target him with rules they conveniently bent for others. It started with letters, little slips of paper stuffed into his mailbox about violations that made no sense. The shade of his paint was too bold, even though it matched the approved palette. His trash cans sat too close to the curb, even though they were in the same place as everyone else's. His grass was an inch too long, though his yard was one of the best kept on the street. One by one, the notices piled up, and one by one he quietly dismissed them, never giving the HOA the reaction they wanted. But silence, for people like them, was never enough. They thrived on dominance, on pushing until someone broke. When the letters didn't work, the harassment escalated. Petty fines, neighbors whispering, HOA board members showing up unannounced at his door with smug smirks, as though their titles gave them a badge of honor. They studied him like he was a problem to be solved, a threat to be neutralized, not realizing that the calm in his eyes wasn't weakness, it was restraint. Behind those calm eyes lived memories of distant deserts, roaring seas, and shadows that moved like predators in the night. He had carried men through firefights, navigated missions no one spoke of, and seen what true fear looked like in the eyes of his enemies. Compared to that, a petty HOA with too much time and too little, humanity was nothing. But the problem was never whether he could handle them. It was whether they would ever stop. And so the HOA made their next move. This time, it wasn't just a letter, or a fine, or a door knock. It was something far bolder, something meant to break not just his peace but his dignity. They hired men in fake uniforms, men who pretended to be the law, and they pointed all their malice toward the one man they should have never touched. The morning the trucks rolled in, the neighborhood held its breath. Black SUVs crept slowly past the stop signs, their tinted windows hiding faces but not intentions. Behind them came two old cruisers, cars dressed up to look official, with flashing lights bolted on top like cheap Halloween costumes. Their arrival wasn't quiet. The sirens blared for a few seconds, just long enough to make everyone step to their windows. Curtains moved, blinds cracked open. Mothers clutched their children and whispered, "Something's happening at his house." The men who climbed out were tall, broad, and full of false confidence. Their uniforms were mismatched, badges stitched unevenly, belts carrying gear that looked borrowed, not earned. Their boots were clean, not the kind worn down by years of real service. And yet, They strutted across the street as if they owned the law itself. To the average eye, it was intimidation wrapped in theatrics. To him, it was laughably transparent, but he didn't laugh. He watched silently from the porch, his arms steady, his gaze unshaken, as they marched closer. The HOA board members weren't far behind. They trailed the fake officers at a safe distance, smirking like spectators at a show they had purchased front-row tickets for. To them, this was victory, the moment they would prove their dominance once and for all. They whispered among themselves about how he should have just followed the rules, how he was finally going to be taught a lesson. Their words dripped with satisfaction, but also with something else, hatred sharpened by the color of his skin. The fake cops fanned out across his driveway. One barked orders, as if rehearsing for a role he had dreamed of playing, shouting about violations, warrants, and penalties. Papers were waved in the air, papers that meant nothing, forged with seals and stamps copied from internet images. Another man reached for his holster, letting the neighborhood catch a glimpse of the weapon he carried, a prop meant to frighten rather than protect. Everything they did was theater, designed for an audience too afraid or too ignorant to challenge them. But this man was not their audience. He had been studied by enemies who truly wanted him dead, tracked through jungles and deserts where one mistake meant never coming home. He had faced men whose cruelty made these pretenders look like children. The calm on his face wasn't ignorance of danger. It was the kind of control only forged in fire. Still, the injustice stung. Because beneath all the theater was a truth the neighborhood couldn't ignore. These men felt bold enough to do this because he was black. They would have never staged this charade outside another neighbor's home. They would have never dared treat a different family this way. But for him, they assumed silence meant weakness and quiet meant surrender. One of the fake cops stepped forward, his chest puffed, his voice booming. "You're under arrest for repeated violations. You don't belong here, and it's time you were removed." The words carried more venom than authority, more prejudice than power. And though the crowd of neighbors didn't cheer, their silence was loud enough to echo. The man stood, unmoved. His stillness unsettled them. They expected shouting, arguing, pleading. Instead, he simply looked into their eyes with a calmness that made their rehearsed aggression falter. For the first time, the fake officers felt a sliver of doubt crawl up their spines. Why wasn't he afraid? Why didn't he resist? Why did his presence feel heavier than their numbers? The HOA board whispered again, urging the men to act, to finish what they had started. And so the fake cops moved closer, circling him, hands hovering over their fake warrants and real weapons. The tension was suffocating now, stretching like a wire pulled to its breaking point. The neighborhood watched, holding its collective breath as the moment of collision drew near. What none of them realized, what no one could yet imagine, was that every step these men took toward him was a step into danger they couldn't comprehend. They weren't about to arrest a neighbor. They were about to provoke the most feared Navy SEAL alive. The first shove came suddenly. A rough hand pressed against his shoulder as one of the fake cops barked for him to get down. The sound of the command was sharp, meant to echo through the neighborhood like a warning. Yet, instead of flinching, the man barely moved. His feet were planted firmly, his posture as steady as a mountain, and his silence was louder than any protest could have been. The officer's shove landed against muscle trained by years of grueling discipline, muscle that had carried brothers in arms through fire and storm. Another officer pulled out cuffs, the metallic clink meant to intimidate. He stepped closer, expecting the man to lower his head, to give in the way others before him might have. But this man did not bow. His eyes, cold and unblinking, locked onto the officer with a calmness that made the man hesitate. For a flicker of a second, doubt cracked through the facade of power, but arrogance quickly patched it over. They tried again, louder this time, with more force. One reached for his arm, another circled behind, as the HOA board watched from a safe distance, smirking as if victory was already theirs. The neighbors whispered, torn between fear and curiosity, their breaths shallow as the scene unfolded like a slow-motion disaster. Then it happened. With a precision so sharp it seemed choreographed, the man shifted his weight, twisted his arm free, and in an instant, the cuff dangled uselessly from the officer's wrist. Gasps rippled across the street. The other officer lunged forward, but before his hand could touch, he was spun, redirected, and sent stumbling backward with nothing more than a flick of controlled strength. The fake cops froze. Their act of dominance had cracked, revealing something they couldn't name but instinctively feared. Because in those movements, in the controlled efficiency of every step, every breath, was a truth no costume or forged badge could mask. This was not a man unfamiliar with confrontation. This was someone who had seen more battles than they had lies. The calm voice that finally broke his silence carried no anger, only weight. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to threaten. His words were simple, and though he did not boast, every syllable dripped with the kind of authority that comes only from surviving the impossible. They had come expecting to arrest a black man they thought was powerless. Instead, they found themselves standing before the most feared Navy SEAL alive, one whose name was whispered with respect in corners of the world they would never dare step into. And in that moment, the battlefield shifted. The predators realized they were the prey. The silence after his revelation was heavy, almost suffocating. The fake cops, who just moments earlier had strutted with false bravado, now stood frozen, their hands trembling as though suddenly aware of the storm they had stirred. For the first time, the HOA board members at the back looked uneasy. Their smirks faltered, their confidence shrinking under the weight of a truth they had never anticipated. They hadn't targeted just any man. They had declared war on someone who had lived through wars they could never imagine. Neighbors who had been watching quietly from their porches now shifted uncomfortably. They weren't just witnessing another HOA dispute. They were witnessing the exposure of something far darker, the casual cruelty of people who thought they could weaponize fear, and the strength of a man who refused to bend beneath it. The man didn't raise his fists. He didn't need to. Instead, he calmly pulled out a phone, pressed a single button, and let the line connect. Within minutes, the distant hum of engines filled the air. Black SUVs, real ones this time, rolled down the street, carrying men and women who didn't need fake uniforms to command respect. Federal agents stepped out, badges gleaming, weapons holstered but ready. They weren't here for him. They were here for those who thought intimidation would be their shield. The fake cops panicked, stumbling over their words, trying to backtrack, to explain away their presence. But forged documents, counterfeit badges, and illegal weapons spoke, louder than any excuse they could muster. They were disarmed, cuffed, and led to the very cruisers they had arrived in. Their heads hung low now, their arrogance evaporated under the weight of real authority. And the HOA board? Their role in orchestrating. The scheme unraveled quickly. Emails, payments, and messages revealed a plan rooted not in justice but in prejudice, not in order but in hatred. They were dragged into the storm they had created, their names splashed across headlines, their reputations dismantled piece by piece. The power they once clung to dissolved in the eyes of the very community they had claimed to protect. The neighborhood would never look at him the same again. Some carried shame in their eyes, realizing they had stood silent while injustice brewed right in front of them. Others carried respect, finally understanding the depth of the man who had lived quietly among them, never boasting about the sacrifices he had made for a country that still allowed him to be treated like a stranger in his own home. But for him, victory was never about humiliation. It was about truth. He had faced enemies far deadlier than the ones on his driveway, but the sting of racism, the weight of prejudice, carried its own kind of battle scars. And yet, once again, he had not let it break him. As the sun set and the street slowly cleared, he stood once more on his porch, silent and steady. To some, he was a neighbor. To others, a protector. But to those who had tried to break him, he would forever be the reminder of a lesson they had learned too late. Never judge a man by the color of his skin. Because sometimes, the man you underestimate is the one whose name the world fears, and, as the story closed, one question lingered. One meant not just for that street, but for everyone watching. How many more times must black men and women prove their worth before society finally sees them for who they are, not the stereotypes others? Project?